The night was quiet, too quiet for war. On the edge of the Pacific, a small island outpost sat surrounded by dark water and drifting clouds. Japanese soldiers, tired but disciplined, patrolled the narrow ridges. They expected one day the Americans would come in force, with battleships, carriers, waves of bombers, and thousands of Marines. That was the kind of storm the Imperial Army had prepared for. But what came instead was unthinkable. In the early hours, before the horizon turned grey, the faint sound of engines broke the silence. Small landing craft pushed through the surf. Inside, a handful of US Marines gripped their rifles. The spray of salt water stung their faces. Their orders were simple, but almost insane. Seize the island and do it fast. When the ramps dropped, chaos erupted. Gunfire cracked across the beach. Grenades thudded into the sand. Marines dashed forward, shouting over the roar of fire. The defenders, expecting at least a regiment, froze when they saw so few attackers. For a moment, disbelief spread faster than bullets. The Japanese fired back, but confusion spread. Some ran to bunkers. Some hesitated, convinced this was only a scouting force. And then, in the confusion, the Marines pressed harder, pushing up ridges, tossing grenades into dugouts, shouting for surrender. By sunrise, the smoke hung over shattered palm trees. The sounds of battle grew weaker, replaced by silence. On this patch of rock and sand, the impossible had happened. A few dozen Marines had captured an island that Tokyo once believed was secure. To the Japanese soldiers who survived, it felt unreal. How could a garrison trained to fight to the last man collapse against such a small enemy? To the Marines, the victory was staggering, both exhilarating and terrifying. They had faced odds that by all logic should have killed them all. This stunning moment, where the might of an empire cracked before a handful of men, was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning, but before we understand how this shocking victory unfolded, we must step back. What was this island? Why was it so important or so forgotten that such a strange battle could take place? In the vast Pacific, maps can be deceiving. Islands that look like tiny specks of coral and rock can change the entire shape of a war. This particular island was no different. Barely a few miles across, covered in jungle and broken reef, it was easy to overlook. American planners noticed it only when they began pushing west. It was not the size of the island that mattered, but its location. It sat like a stepping stone between larger bases, too small for a city, too rough for farming, but perfect as a listening post, an airstrip, or a supply stop. For Japan, it was a useful outpost. A handful of men could watch the sea lanes, signal back to larger bases, and give warning if US forces approached. It was a pinprick in the Pacific, but a pinprick that could bleed time and resources from the enemy. Still, the island was not considered critical. Tokyo's priority lay in holding giants like Truk Lagoon, Rabaul, or Saipan. Compared to those, this rock seemed like a backwater. That is why only a modest garrison was stationed there. The men were not the elite. They were soldiers and sailors rotated in to watch the horizon, build bunkers, and survive the heat. To the United States, the island became a problem of opportunity. If left in Japanese hands, it could signal convoys and spot patrols. If taken, it could serve as a small but useful foothold. The decision was made: capture it quickly, with as little force as possible. This was not to be a grand invasion. There would be no battleships lining the horizon, or fleets of bombers darkening the sky. Instead, the mission was given to a small detachment of Marines. The logic was simple: strike fast, hit hard, and overwhelm the garrison before Tokyo even noticed. But such logic was dangerous. The Pacific was littered with islands where American troops expected light resistance and instead found hell. Hidden tunnels, camouflaged bunkers, defenders who fought to the death. A single mistake here could trap the Marines, leaving them stranded, cut off, and destroyed. Still, the gamble was taken. As dawn approached on that fateful day, the island itself seemed to wait. The surf pounded against sharp reefs, palm trees bent in the ocean wind. Somewhere inside the jungle, Japanese soldiers stirred awake, still unaware of what was coming. When the Marines landed, the island's quiet role in the Pacific vanished forever. This place, so small, so overlooked, became the stage for one of the war's strangest victories. And as the smoke of battle cleared, one fact became undeniable. The Japanese had been stunned, not by an armada, not by overwhelming force, but by a handful of men who refused to back down. To understand why this tiny island fell so fast, we need to see what Japan believed about its defenses. The Empire of Japan built its war plan on a chain of island fortresses. Each one was meant to slow the Americans. Each garrison was told to fight to the death, to bleed the enemy and buy time. On paper, it looked strong. Caves, bunkers, trenches, and hidden guns made even small islands feel like fortresses. Maps sent to Tokyo were filled with arrows, showing how these dots of land could form a shield across the Pacific. But there was a problem. Many outposts were too far apart. Supplies were short. Reinforcements were late. Some garrisons were forgotten as the war stretched on. What looked powerful from Tokyo often felt fragile on the ground. On this island, the Japanese had built bunkers out of coral rock. They stacked sandbags along the ridges. Machine guns pointed toward the beach. They believed if the enemy came, they could at least hold long enough for help. The men followed strict orders. Never surrender. They were told it was shameful to give up, even when outnumbered. Some carried grenades not just for the enemy, but for themselves if capture seemed certain. Yet reality was different. By the time the Marines came, the garrison was underfed, undersupplied, and cut off. Radios worked only sometimes. Ammunition was limited. Still, they clung to the belief that their fortress was secure. That is why the next part of the story is so striking. Against all training, against all orders, this garrison collapsed in hours. And the reason is tied not only to their weakness, but to the men who attacked them. The Marines who landed here were not many, barely more than a company, led by officers who knew the risks. They were chosen for speed, toughness, and the ability to adapt under fire. Most were young. Some had already seen combat on other islands. Others were facing their first true test. But all carried the same mindset: win fast or die trying. Training had shaped them into a sharp tool. They drilled on how to land under fire, how to clear bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers, how to use hand signals when radios failed. They knew the Pacific was not about grand battles alone. It was about survival in jungles, caves, and beaches. One Marine later said it felt like stepping into another world. The ocean behind them, the thick jungle in front, and the knowledge that no one else was coming. They were it. The plan was simple, almost reckless. Hit the beach, move fast, take out the bunkers before the enemy could organize. Every minute counted. If the Japanese had realized how few Marines there were, they might have pushed back with full force. But confusion was the Marines' ally. They carried rifles, bars, a few light mortars. Every man knew his role. Some were riflemen meant to push forward. Others carried explosives to knock out dugouts. The small size of the unit meant they depended on each other completely. What gave them an edge was not numbers, but attitude. They were used to taking risks. They were used to improvising. And most of all, they trusted their leaders. Orders were short and clear: move, strike, finish it fast. As the landing craft ground onto the reef, each Marine knew this could be his last day. But instead of fear, many felt a strange calm. They had trained for this moment. What happened next, the lightning assault that shocked Japan, was not luck alone. It was the product of preparation, courage, and the will of men who refused to hesitate. The stage was set. The fortress was waiting, and a handful of Marines were about to break it wide open. The landing began before the sun fully rose. Small boats cut through the waves, engines rumbling low. Inside, the Marines checked their rifles and grenades. No speeches, no fanfare, just the sound of water hitting steel. Ahead, the dark line of the island grew clearer. The first craft hit the reef and ramps dropped. Marines splashed into the surf, pushing forward through waist-high water. Almost instantly, gunfire ripped across the beach. Tracers lit the dawn. Bullets snapped overhead. The Marines did not stop. They ran through the sand, firing back in short bursts. Grenades flew into bunkers. One squad climbed a ridge and sprayed fire into a trench. Every second counted. The Japanese defenders answered with rifles and machine guns. Palm trees shattered. Sand kicked up in clouds. A mortar shell landed near the surf, throwing water and bodies into the air. But the Marines pushed harder. Speed was their weapon. Instead of forming long lines or waiting for orders, they split into small groups, moving bunker to bunker. One Marine pulled the pin on a grenade and tossed it into a dugout. Silence followed by smoke. Another Marine carrying a flamethrower swept fire across a hidden nest, clearing it in seconds. To the Japanese, it was chaos. They had prepared for waves of attackers. Instead, this small force came at them fast and close. Radios failed. Officers shouted orders, but confusion spread. Some soldiers ran deeper into the jungle. Others fought briefly, then broke. One survivor later admitted, "We thought they were more. They came from everywhere." By mid-morning, the Marines controlled the beach and most of the ridges. Smoke curled above palm trees. The sound of gunfire grew thinner. Marines searched dugouts, calling for surrender. A few Japanese soldiers dropped their rifles and raised their hands, something almost unheard of in this war. Others chose death. One defender pulled a grenade to his chest and vanished in the blast. Another tried to charge with a bayonet and was cut down instantly. Still, the fight collapsed faster than anyone expected. By noon, the island was silent, except for the crackle of fire and the distant surf. The Marines had done the impossible. With only a handful of men, they had captured an entire Japanese garrison. But while the beach lay quiet, thousands of miles away, the news would explode like a bomb. In Tokyo, reports from the front shocked the high command. First came a short radio message: "Island lost." At first, officers assumed it was a mistake. How could a garrison, trained to fight to the last man, fall so quickly? How could so few Americans take it? More reports arrived. The island had been captured by no more than a company of Marines. Not a division, not a fleet, a company. The reaction inside Tokyo was disbelief, followed by anger. Some accused the garrison of cowardice. Others blamed poor supply lines. A few feared this was a warning of something larger, that American tactics were changing, and Japan's defenses were weaker than they looked. For a nation built on honor and sacrifice, the loss was humiliating. Newspapers avoided printing details. Propaganda officers twisted the story, calling it a temporary setback. But inside the military, the truth spread fast. Japan's island chain was not unbreakable. The shock went beyond pride. If a small band of Marines could topple one outpost, what would happen when the full weight of America came? How many other islands, thought to be secure, could fall in the same way? Tokyo's silence said it all. The empire that had once seemed unstoppable was now vulnerable, not to great armadas, but to daring strikes by small groups of determined men. For the Marines resting on that scorched island, the victory was real and immediate. For the Japanese high command, it was a nightmare, proof that the war in the Pacific was slipping from their control. When the shooting stopped, the Marines stood among broken trees and burned bunkers. The air was heavy with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Victory was clear, but so was the cost. Some Marines lay silent on the sand, their helmets tilted, rifles still in hand. Others were wounded, calling for corpsmen. The men who survived felt both relief and sorrow. They had done the impossible, but not without paying for it. One Marine later wrote in his diary, "It felt strange. We won, but it didn't feel like winning. Too many of us didn't walk back." The survivors moved slowly across the island, checking every dugout. They carried their dead to the beach, laying them gently in rows. Even in triumph, silence hung heavy. The youngest Marines, some only 19, stared at the bodies of friends they had eaten breakfast with only hours earlier. Food and water were scarce. Ammunition was low. The men were exhausted, but they kept working, setting guards, building fires, tending to the wounded. They knew Japanese reinforcements could come at any moment, yet in those tired faces was pride. They had proven that courage and speed could shatter a garrison thought unbreakable. Their commanders praised them, but the Marines themselves spoke little. Most just sat in the sand, smoking quietly, thinking about what had happened. For them, the island was not a symbol or a headline. It was sweat, blood, and survival. A place where they had fought like madmen and somehow lived. A place they would never forget. News of the capture spread quickly through American lines. Radios crackled with the story. Officers repeated it to their men. The reaction was electric. For US forces fighting across the Pacific, the victory was a spark of hope. If a handful of Marines could seize an island, then maybe the long, brutal march across the ocean could be won faster than expected. Newspapers back home turned it into a headline. "Few Marines take whole island." Families cheered, soldiers smiled, and morale rose. Propaganda officers used the story well. Posters and radio broadcasts told Americans their sons were unbeatable. Every small victory mattered, and this one felt larger than its size on the map. But for Japan, the echo was darker. Commanders began to doubt their island chain. If one outpost could fall so fast, what about the rest? Could the Americans strike anywhere, at any time? The sense of invincibility was broken. Strategists in Tokyo argued over what to do. Some wanted to strengthen every garrison. Others said it was impossible. The empire was stretched too thin. Supplies could not reach every island. Reinforcements were already too few. In truth, this single event did not change the whole war, but it revealed something bigger. The balance was shifting. Japan was no longer advancing. It was holding on, and sometimes failing to even hold. For the Marines who fought there, the echoes were personal. They carried the memory of that day through the rest of the war. Some went on to fight at Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima. Others never left the Pacific alive, but all of them remembered the island where so few men had stunned an empire. The Pacific War was far from over, but after this moment, both sides knew the truth. Even small battles could shake giants.